It's about the holistic assessment process that you've developed in community renewal. Can you tell me how it came about?
Yeah, I think it was around about 2004, 2005. We created a new role within community renewal called Health Case Manager. And what we were finding was that a lot of our work in poorer communities, we were finding some people who wanted to go into work, who required, kind of normal kind of support that you would get around building their CV, bit of practical support around job search, etc. But we also found a lot of people who said that they wanted to get into work, but had a lot more barriers, really, and maybe we'd be working with them for a while and things weren't happening for them, and we realised that we had to do something different. We had to do something different from what the kind of mainstream employment agencies were doing. And the holistic assessment was the tool that we developed to be able to go a wee bit deeper with people, right, to get a bigger picture.
So can you just maybe summarise what it's about? What's the purpose of it then?
Yeah, it's another one of what we call a reflection tool. Earlier on we talked about our listening survey, which is a critical reflection tool. The holistic assessment's a reflection tool as well. And it's really, I suppose it's what it says on the tin, it's holistic. So it's trying to build a picture of, the whole of a person's life, including how they spend their time, their relationships, their social opportunities, their social life. It looks at their health, it looks at how they think about their health, feel about their health. It looks at their debt situation, it looks at their housing situation, and it looks at what they want to achieve in the future. It tries to get them thinking into the future.
So it sounds pretty comprehensive. I mean, you wouldn't use it with everybody. How would you decide who to use it with?
Well, it's probably best used with people either who are having trouble achieving the goals that they've set for themselves, or with people who maybe can't even get to the stage of being very clear about their goal. They seem to be coming up against a lot more barriers, and find it difficult to kind of create a vision for themselves. People really that need to remove a lot more obstacles before they can begin to work on their goal.
So would these be people that community renewal had already got to know in some way, already working with them?
Usually, the holistic assessment's used in different contexts.
Right.
We use it in our area-based work, where a lot of the work that we do would be about supporting people into employment. But we also use it in our health-based work, because as a tool, it's equally applicable because it's giving you the whole picture. So if somebody wants to set a goal around improving their health, but they're finding it difficult, or there's barriers in the way, then we would use it with them as well to try and help them identify, well, what is it that's important to you, and how can we help you, achieve some of that.
So what sort of skills would you need to be able to carry out a holistic assessment?
Some of the skills that you would need would be similar to the sort of skills that you would need in, say, for example, counselling. The ability to listen, not just listen to what the person's saying, but listen to what's behind what the person's saying. You need to be able to read between the lines, and you need to be able to understand what they're not saying as well. Sometimes it's what they're not saying which gives us a clue, and we can see that through observation, observing their body language, etc. But also reflecting back. It's important to be able to listen and summarise and reflect back and check your understanding. And also, to be empathetic, to have a lot of empathy, not sympathy, but have empathy for the person's predicament, for the situation that they find themselves in, and to carry out, this assessment in a very non-judgmental way. Somebody may start talking about a drug habit that they've got, or alcoholism, or quite often, we find people who can't move forward because of something that's happened in maybe past in their childhood, around abuse and things like that. So, so we need to be able to cope with hearing some of this. It's not that we need to sort it out during the holistic assessment. If we feel that somebody needs some specialist support, then we can bring that in.
So you definitely would need to have some training to be able to do this.
Yeah. We've developed a training package for the holistic assessment, which involves a little bit about the background, the philosophy behind it, where it came from. I could talk about that in a minute if you like. The different parts of the holistic assessment, and also what's behind each question. Some of the questions, at first glance might seem, what are you asking that for? So we go over all that, and we give people quite a bit of opportunity to practice that.
And how long would the whole thing take?
Usually a holistic assessment should take a minimum of about an hour and a half. It doesn't need to be done in the one go. It can be done in 3 parts. We've divided it into 3 parts so that there are natural breaks along the way. Sometimes, you might find that it's possible to start and go right through the whole holistic assessment in one go. And in other times, it might just be too much for the person, or we might go through quite a lot of the first 2 sets of questions and realise there's a lot of stuff to be worked out before we start looking to the future and looking at kind of future vision.
So can you give me an example of some of the questions then?
Yeah.
What they're trying to get at?
Well, as I said, the holistic assessment's in 3 parts, and the first part is really around their leisure and social and relationships, their social life, their leisure and relationships. So we would begin, the holistic assessment by asking the person, tell me a bit about your typical week. And the good thing about having that question at the beginning is it gives the person who's doing the holistic assessment the chance to take a step back and really observe the client, how they answer, what their body language is saying, are they anxious, are they kind of depressed, are they kind of within themselves, are they very kind of closed? Because they have to, it takes a couple of minutes at least to explain your typical week. It's a good chance to start to build kind of first impression. But it also gives us quite a lot of information that we can then use to build on later on. And also the first set of questions are very, if you like, non-threatening. Everybody can answer, the first set of questions. So we'll ask people about their typical week. Then we'll move on to talk about, do you get the time to do something that you like? And we're interested in what their kind of recreation, if they've got time, what do they do with their time? Do they have any hobbies? Do they have any hobbies that take place outside the home? Do they have any hobbies that take place inside the home? If they've got time on their hands but they're not using it in that way, we'll be interested to find out, well, did you used to have any hobbies? Or maybe there's something that you've always fancied doing but you've never really got round to doing, and that can open up quite a lot of conversation as well about what the person did in their childhood, and it gives us a bit of an insight into, maybe what they were like before they get stuck into the kind of rut that they were in.
That sounds fairly gentle questions, but at the same time, it might be difficult for some people to to get into some of these areas. Do you find people respond quite well to that question?
Yeah, well, you know, at the start of the holistic assessment, we explained to people, look, some of these questions are going to be relevant to you, and we might spend quite a bit of time on them. Other questions might not be relevant, not be that relevant to you, and we may spend less time on them. So we're not particularly bothered if, you know, there's not much to say in a particular question. Then we'll just move on to the next one.
So what are the next kind of questions you ask?
The next question would be around, do they get the opportunity to socialise? And do they get the chance to meet up with their friends? And we're interested in, not only do they get the chance to meet up with their friends, but we're also interested in how long have they had these friendships? Do they have any friendships that go all the way back to childhood, for example? Which kind of gives us a bit of a clue to the person that we're dealing with. Or have they lost touch with all their friends? Are they socially isolated? Or is finance a big problem? You know, again, for a lot of people, they want to socialise with their friends, but they're not working, they don't have the money. Some of their friends are maybe working and they just can't, you know, they can't afford to go on nights out, etc. We also ask a little bit about the family and whether they have family close by. Do they get a chance to meet up with their family? We're interested in the role that they have within the family. Do they provide support to other family members? Do other family members provide support to them? And after those 4 questions, you know, that's really the kind of end of the first part of the holistic assessment.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And already we're beginning to get a reasonably good picture of how they spend their week. You know, is it mainly at home? Do they get out and about? Or do they work? Are they involved in any voluntary activity? Do they go anywhere? Do they go to any clubs? Do they have any hobbies inside or, you know, out in the community? Do they have friends? Are they isolated? And a little bit about their family situation. So we're beginning to, you know, we've got the first piece of the jigsaw in place. And at that point we would stop and say, you know, that's us reached the end of the first part. Would you like to continue just now, or would you like to take a break? We could maybe meet another day. So we give them the opportunity to.
And the next part is more about them personally, is it? Right.
The next part, yeah. The second part really is more about kind of how they look after themselves, and it's probably getting more into some of the sort of barriers that people would face.
Right.
And we start off by asking people, you know, do you feel that you get time to kind of look after yourself? And that's quite a vague kind of question, and sometimes people say, well, what do you mean by that? You know, and there are different ways of kind of paraphrasing that. You know, we could maybe paraphrase that around diet, for example. You know, do you get the chance to eat sort of cooked meals most days? Or if it was around maybe something like alcohol, you know, do you have any concerns about your health?
Do you ask fairly direct questions about maybe people drinking too much or whatever, or does that just come out in the answers?
No, we wouldn't ask direct questions, but if somebody, you know, if we say, do you get the time to look after yourself, it really depends on the context of the holistic assessment is really important. What we're trying to do is not fire questions at people so that they're feeling, you know, under pressure. We're trying to create a very safe environment where people will organically talk about what's actually most important and what's really holding them back. So if we can create that safe, you know, environment, people will often tell us about, you know, concerns about alcohol dependency, or the beginnings of alcohol dependency. And if they bring that up, then yeah, we would probably want to probe a little bit deeper. You know, so we would maybe ask them, well, you know, how many days in the week do you normally have a drink? And can you give us an idea of, you know, what you would drink normally?
And you find that people quite happy to talk about that sort of thing.
If they bring it up first,
Right.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
If they bring that up as an issue, as
Mm-hmm.
something that's concerning them about their health.
Mm-hmm.
And it really depends on the kind of the level of trust that's there.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose that's one of the key skills in doing the holistic assessment is to be quite easy, and quite calm,
Mm-hmm.
and create this space.
I suppose if you did it over 2 or 3 times, then people would maybe build up a bit of trust as well. You don't have to go straight in at the
you don't have
deep
to
end, do you?
Yeah, no, and it's very much it's an evolving picture.
Right.
The holistic assessment will evolve a picture over time, and the chances are that it may not be the first time that the person meets the person who's doing the holistic assessment. The chances are they'll have met them before.
Right. What about some other maybe more difficult areas about medications that they might be on, or mental health issues that they're finding difficult to talk about? I mean, does that sometimes come out in this assessment process?
Yeah. Before we actually get into the questions, we've got a small set of questions that we would go through with people, where we would ask about, any health issues that we should be aware of, or any medications. We'd find out a bit about who their GP is, etc. So sometimes things will come out at that stage. But again, the question about is there anything about your health that concerns you? That's often where people will talk about, say, for example, depression, or the fact that they're on antidepressants and things like that. And maybe they want to get off the antidepressants, or they've been on them for a while, or but they would like to move forward, but they're a wee bit stuck.
When you're asking some of these questions, does it sometimes happen that people might get upset, or start crying or anything? Do you have to be prepared for that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think that the more trust and the more safe people feel, the more likely they are to come out with some of their deeper obstacles. And it's, unfortunately, in one of our projects, in a health project that we run, a lot of the people had been referred to us actually by their GP to try and achieve what seemed like fairly straightforward, I'm not saying it's easy, but fairly straightforward things like managing, their diabetes a bit better, or maybe getting off smoking, or going to the gym, or whatever. But when we, go out and visit them and do the holistic assessment, we may find that they've been depressed for quite a number of years, or maybe suffering from bereavement issues, or also, maybe stuff that's gone on in their childhood where they've been abused and they've never really had the chance to talk to anyone about it. So some of these things can come out during the holistic assessment.
So this could sometimes be the first time they've spoken about it for a long time, or at all?
Very often,
right.
We find that this could be the first time that they've had the chance to speak about it.
But as you say, it's maybe getting into what maybe some of the real barriers are, and if you don't deal with that, you're not really dealing with anything, really.
Yeah, that's the whole purpose of this, is to really it's to go deeper and find what the deeper barriers are, but also, it's to find out what the deeper motivations are as well. We towards the end of the process, we feed back to people what we've picked up, what we get a sense of, and we try to get them to score what their priorities are for taking things forward, and that's quite important, because
so that's the final part that you talked about. Is it moving on to something a bit more positive to come out of it?
Yeah, well, there are a few other questions in the second part, which we look at, for example, their housing situation, if there are any issues around their housing. We'll look at how they manage juggling the bills, if there are any debt issues. And once we've kind of gone through, we look at their ability to get out and about. We look at what we call their geographical reach, and we're really interested in where what sort of radius they live their life in. You know, some people, particularly in deprived areas, they don't really leave their housing scheme very much. So they might do all the shopping in the corner shop. They don't have access to a car, so they might not go to supermarkets on the edge of town or whatever. So we ask a few questions around that as well.
And you ask about work and whether they're in work or not in work, or whether they want to get back to work. And
we would ask, we would ask that during what we call a registration form.
Oh right, so it's already done. Yeah.
So we ask them, you know, if they're in work or if they used to work, and we ask them what they did and how long ago they stopped working, and more or less what was the reason.
So it's a pretty comprehensive picture. I suppose that's what you mean by a holistic assessment.
It's a very comprehensive picture, and you know, we arrive at a place which is very much guided by the client themselves. You know, and it gives us, you know, we don't take copious notes during the holistic assessment, but we do take some notes, but also we by building up a bit of a picture, we build up a bit of a bank of evidence, and some of the evidence that we want to capture really is evidence of where the person actually might be functioning pretty well. You know, very often people with low confidence and low self-esteem can't see anything positive about themselves, whereas this tool gives us the chance to actually build up a bit of evidence of areas, parts of their life where they're actually functioning well. And if you think of a kind of triangle, we're really looking at three different points of view. We're interested in the client's point of view in terms of how they see themselves, and we're looking at our point of view because, you know, what impressions we're getting of them, but we're also building up some evidence, and that would be the kind of third part of the triangle. We're building up evidence that we can then use to help them maybe to look at themselves in a slightly different way and realise, well, you might, you know, there may be certain areas in your life where things are actually going pretty well for you and you've managed to achieve quite a bit, you know, and there'll be other areas where you feel that, you know, you've got needs and you might need a bit of support in.
And you also talked about barriers. It sounds to me as if there are barriers that are coming from the person themselves, but also maybe barriers, external barriers to do with their lives or money or something like that.
Yeah, very much so. I think, you know, when people are trying to achieve some sort of a life change goal, you know, be it get back to work or change something, lose weight, stop smoking or whatever, then there are different barriers that they face. And some of those barriers are internal, and they're around their thought process and fear, and, you know, they can be emotional barriers relating to fear, or they could be rational barriers related to how they think. But some of them are, you know, quite practical external barriers as well. So when we talk about family, etc., you know, we'll find out about, you know, dependence and the age of the children and what the children are doing. And very often when people want to make a change in their life, a barrier can be the knock-on effect on their family. You know, particularly we find that with women, say, who want to get back to work. You know, we'll have a woman who wants to get back to work, and sometimes the barrier might be the attitude of the partner. Does the partner want her to get back to work? Or the attitude of the children? Do the children want her to go back to work? Because they're used to coming home from school and their mum being there, and, you know, that would be a kind of very different situation. So we're trying to look at evidence as well that will help us support the person to sustain their goal. And very often, you know, another way of approaching supporting people towards a goal is just ignore all this stuff and then deal with the obstacles as they come up. But we find that if we can actually spend a bit more time with people at this stage, then we've already anticipated a lot of the barriers.
And it sounds like you might have to bring in, or at least be very much aware of, not just the person, but also the person's family and all this stuff that's going on around about them. You can't just deal with the person themselves.
No, very much so. And I think the holistic assessment lends itself to taking a whole family approach. And the first few questions we ask specifically about the family and, you know, the family makeup, whether there's a partner there, there's children there, there are parents there, you know, we try to find out. But also what we're interested in is, as the person moves towards identifying a goal, we're interested in what support are they going to get from their friends and family towards the goal, but also what support are they going to provide themselves towards the goal, because sometimes you know, we need to actually coach people to provide support for themselves.
So how do you get, I think you were talking about 3 stages, so is the 3rd stage about the goals that you're now talking about?
Yeah.
So how does that work then?
Really, what we want to do is to try and get the person, if we feel in the first instance that they can look forward maybe a year and a half into the future, then we would ask them to imagine, you know, if you could imagine making a change in your life being better in 12 months' time, or indeed, can you imagine what your kind of dream life would be like in 12 months' time? What would it be? And try to get them to identify, you know, what it is that they really want. Because, you know, again, in mainstream employment kind of agencies, somebody comes through the door and says, I want to get a wee job as a cleaner. And, you know, immediately we say, okay, right, sit down, we'll start, you know, developing your CV, and, you know, we'll start pulling up all the jobs for being a cleaner. But, you know, do we stop and say, well, why is it that you want, I'm not saying anything against being a cleaner, but why is it that you want to be a cleaner? And is that what you've always wanted to do, or are there other things that you've wanted to do? The holistic assessment is really about trying to find out what is it you really, really want. You know, and if we can find out what people really want, the chances of them sustaining it are, you know, infinitely higher.
But is that realistic? Do you think people can be realistic about what they want?
I think so. I think they need a bit of coaxing sometimes to raise their expectations. You know, people's expectations in areas of deprivation are very low, and I think sometimes we have to really work alongside them to raise their expectations. You know, so that they're given the chance to at least reflect on, you know, what would be my dream kind of situation, what would be my dream job, and if it's, you know, if it's very, very long journey to get there, then our job is to help them to work out, well, what would the steps be, and that may involve them adjusting, you know, their ambition according to how much time they're prepared to invest in it.
So is there some sort of plan? Is there a plan developed out of this, and some sort of steps on the way? How does that come about?
The assessment we can either stop after the first 10 questions and feedback, and when we feed back on the questions, we're not feeding back on everything they've told us, because that would just be, you know, pointless.
Kind of a summary, is it?
Yeah. So it's really, we're looking for 4 or 5 points that we've seen during the conversation that we think this seems to be quite important for you to either deal with or to achieve. And it's possible that we may not move on to the vision until we start to address some of these things, or we go all the way through to the vision and we feed back on 3 or 4 things that they've mentioned, plus we'll feed back on their ultimate goal. And what we get them to do then is to score how important each of these things is on a scale of 1 to 10. So they begin to prioritise what they think that they should start working on first. For example, maybe one of the main issues is debt. You know, they may have housing arrears, or they may have other debts where they're frozen at the moment because they're unemployed, but the minute they get a job, these debts would be reactivated. So they may be one of the things that we have to work on first.
Right. So what happens if they score something high that you don't think should be as high, and they score something low that maybe you think really is more important. How does that work?
Well, ultimately it's their score, so it's important that we respect their score. But if something's very incongruent, if they scored something really low that seemed really important to them during the conversation, then you just point that out by saying, I'm a little bit surprised that you scored that.
Is that maybe
2.
because they're a bit scared of it, though? Scared of maybe what the consequences of that? Sometimes
people will score things lower because they think, well, I don't know if I could handle that at the moment. And again, it's important as part of the scoring process just to check out with people. I'm a little bit surprised that that you've given it that score, because earlier on you were saying, that's what I was talking about, building up this bank of evidence. It's important that that we've got evidence to be able to say, well, on the one hand you were saying before that this is what you really want, and when you come to the scoring you've only scored at a 2. Help me understand that. But we would never turn around and say, oh no, you've only scored that at 2, that should have been a 10.
Yeah.
It's got to be there.
So it sounds like you've got to go with where they are, because you'll get a better response, maybe a better motivation to do something about it then.
Definitely. This process is really about trying to put them in the driving seat for their own life. It's about trying. I know it's a kind of well-worn phrase, empowerment, but it's about trying to empower them to begin to take responsibility and take steps towards. It helps them to identify and untangle some of the barriers that have maybe kept them stuck.
You could have 3, 4, 5 things that they've scored. I mean, do they get on and do all of them at once, or what happens next?
Normally what we would do is, and this comes down to, I suppose, the skill of the person that's doing the holistic assessment or the judgment, is we would maybe take the highest scoring priority and look at that, but we would also look in the priorities for anything that we think could be possibly tackled quite quickly.
So what sort of thing?
So for example, I mentioned earlier on debt, So debt, paying off the debt isn't necessarily going to happen overnight, but getting some support to get a plan to look at paying off the debt is something that we can usually organise for people fairly quickly.
Right.
So, that could be the highest scorer, or it could be one of the things that we can deal with reasonably quickly. Or it may be a question around the person's housing or something like that. It may be helping them to explore what they would like to do if they went to college, something like that. So usually we'd pick 2 things and we'd try to get working on a couple of things straight away and begin to explore the other things in more detail in subsequent meetings. After the holistic assessment, we would really want to be meeting people on a weekly basis.
Right.
And as you said earlier,
find out how people are doing.
Yeah, we would develop a plan,
right,
and the plan would have their ultimate goal, and it would also have their stepping stone goals.
Yeah. And would you bring in other agencies at that point? Because it sounds like, there could be quite a lot of specialist advice needed here.
Yeah. And I think that's very much, it's part of the reason why we developed the holistic assessment, was to identify what sort of support our people are going to require in order to achieve their ultimate goal. And that could be, for example, it may be bringing in some support to help them manage their stress, or it could be about dealing with some kind of underlying emotional, rational issue which is stopping them. So we may bring in, for example, counselling support, and get the person working with a counsellor for a period of time. And when they start to make a bit of progress, come back to us, and then we may introduce them to money advice, for example.
Do you get them to rescore it, if to see how they've done? Does that work? Does that work? Does it?
Yes. Yeah. We've got two ways of rescoring the holistic assessment. One is after a period. It could be, for example, 3 months. We would get them to look at their original scores, and we would, ask them these priorities, would they still have the same score out of 10? So if we look at the 5 areas that they've picked, back then you scored this a 10, what would you score it now? Is it still a 10? Or is it, now a 6 or a 7? Because, maybe people have started to deal with some things, and so as a priority they've come down. But we also get them to score each of these things in terms of how much progress do you feel you've made towards achieving that. So from 0 to 100, so what percentage do you feel that you've progressed towards that goal? And again, that would maybe be done on a 3-monthly basis.
I can imagine that people could feel quite good after that, though. They see that they've actually made some progress, even if it's just a little way.
Yeah, that's one of the uses of this as a tool, because if we only measure people's success in terms of they got a job, or they got a training course, or they stopped smoking, or they lost a stone, then there's a lot of people who are on the journey towards that. And if we only measure these very hard indicators, then those people don't have anything to show for the time that they've invested or the time that we've invested. So this process allows us to look at a bunch of things that they identified as being important to them to deal with or to tackle, and it allows them to look at, well, actually, no, I would say I'm 70% of the way there. I haven't got the job yet, but I feel a lot better about myself, and I'm going out a lot more, or I've re-established contact with my friends, or whatever it is. It allows us to measure what are sometimes called soft indicators.
I mean, in some ways, even though what you've described can be in situations where people have got a lot of issues and barriers, it seems to me that it's a process you can use in a fairly low-key way, just, trying to support people. It's an idea, it's a tool that can be a short or a big thing, depending on the person.
For me, I don't see any reason why everybody that comes through the doors of community renewal shouldn't go through this process. Because the sooner we start to identify what is it you really want, and what are some of the things that are going to potentially trip you up along the way, then it's easier to deal with them maybe before they actually trip the person up. So we're not talking about the kind of snakes and ladders where they make a bit of progress and they fall all the way back down, and they've got to kind of pick themselves up, dust themselves off and start again. If we can second guess what some of these things are going to be and put support in place, then the progress can be a lot quicker.
There's also signs of it is coming from the person, so you're not saying, oh, well, this is what we think you need. It's the other way around. That's what it sounds like.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting in some of our health work where, this as a different approach to, say, going to the doctor and talking about very narrow symptoms. Oh, I'm feeling down, or I'm feeling depressed, or I've got terrible backache, or whatever. Where all the doctor can do in their 7 or 8 minutes is write a prescription to deal with the symptom. But this is really about looking much more holistically and trying to get the person motivated and taking responsibility for setting their own ultimate goals, but also helping us to identify what they need to do to get there.
But clearly, for some people, it does take a bit of time. And what would you say to the criticism? Well, a lot of agencies don't have that sort of time. We really can't be spending 2 or 3 hours with somebody. We haven't got the resources to do that. So, what's your answer to that?
I think that our experience is that if we invest that time at the start, we save the time later on. And arguably, by not having a process like this, we'll end up spending a lot more time later on in the journey picking the person back up when they've had a fall, trying to sort out things that we hadn't we didn't have any foresight about. So I actually don't think in the reality that it does take any more time. It's maybe just a slightly bigger investment of time at the beginning.
So, I mean, community renewal calls it holistic assessment. You've given us a wee idea where it came from in the first place, but do other people use these tools, or is there something specific to the community renewal way of doing things that you would suggest?
I think that, that there are, of course, there are all sorts of assessment tools that are used. In the medical profession, you'll have physiotherapists will do an assessment, occupational therapists will do an assessment, mental health people will do an assessment. But the way that the assessment is done it can be quite different. It could be a set of very closed questions where the person's asked, maybe 70 questions and the answer is yes or no, and a computer works out, what's wrong with them or whatever. Or, this is very developmental, and it's based on, I think what is different about this is it's based on what we call a critical reflection process. And we're encouraging the person to really reflect, maybe for the first time ever, reflect on their own life and how they've got to where they're at and where it is that they want to go. And it's very focused on where they want to go, whereas a lot of other assessments are focused on a person's, problems. This is really focused on, it's not focusing on the problems, it's focusing on this is where you want to go, but in order to get there, you may have to address this and this and this, but if we're aware of that at the start, then it's better.
So are there some basic underlying questions that you would always ask in this holistic assessment?
Yeah. Well, there are 4 really underlying questions in the holistic assessment, but we don't actually ask them.
All right.
So if you like, they're the kind of the current that runs through the whole process. And the first of the 4 is, what is it that you really want to achieve? What is it that you really want? And that's probably the most important underlying question. And following on from that, we want to know, what is it that's really holding you back from achieving this? And again, we wouldn't ask that out as a question, but that's what...
It's kind of implicit.
That's what we're really trying to discover through the other questions, is what is it that's really holding you back? And the third kind of underlying question is, what are you going to do about it? Or what would you like to do about it? Are you prepared to start to deal with some of this and tackle some of this? And the fourth question underlying the holistic assessment is, what support are you going to need to be able to deal with what's holding you back? And community renewal are interested in what support do you need from us, but also what support do you need from our partner agencies. And those are the kind of 4 underlying questions that effectively encapsulate the whole process.
Okay. So it sounds like it can be a pretty intensive process and maybe take a bit of time. And what would you say to people said, well, if people said, we haven't got the time or resources to give, there's a lot of clients to see and we haven't got many staff, this is quite a big thing that you're talking about here.
Yeah. I think, in a way, this is a bit of a culture shift. A lot of agencies that we've come across in the past will sign people off on a plan where there's no real motivation. The person is basically just said, oh yeah, that'll do. And when there's no motivation, the chances of that plan becoming sustainable are much, much less. So we believe that if we don't just sign somebody off on a plan when there's no motivation, but we really find what is it that you really want to do, that by tapping into that motivation, we'll be able to help that person sustain the goal. And if you look at our experience over the last 7 years, I think around about 70 to 75% of people that we've supported to achieve an employment goal have managed to sustain their job at least for a year.
So the investment pays off in the end, is what you're saying?
Yeah, very much so. There's an initial investment, but it pays off in terms of people staying in the job and being able to get over that very rough transition period of moving from long-term unemployment back into work. This is very important in that.
Okay, thanks.